Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm excited to present my capstone to you on dark patterns, otherwise known as deceptive and manipulative user interface design. I'll start with a background of what dark patterns are and provide some examples on where you may come across them online. I'll then offer a brief analysis of relevant literature and the lawsuits that are holding companies accountable for their use of dark patterns. And finally, the presentation will conclude with policy options for the Canadian government going forward. Okay, so to begin, dark patterns are prevalent in daily interactions online, but what exactly are they? Dark patterns are potentially manipulative instances of user interface design on websites and apps that trick users into doing things they didn't intend to. The term was coined by UX specialist Harry Brignall in 2010 when he identified 12 types of dark patterns as listed on the screen, which can be found across social media, e-commerce, financial services, and most online spaces. Further research on dark patterns has built upon Brignall's initial classifications to create 5 taxonomies that these tactics can fall into. The first one is nagging, and it's a sort of separate category from Brignall's original 12. Nagging is a minor redirection of expected functionality that may persist over one or more interactions. So for example, pop-ups that obscure the interface. An example of this is where a designer requests something but doesn't allow the user to permanently decline the request. So as you can see on the left with the dark pattern, the user can only choose to allow access now or potentially later, whereas the ethical pattern on the right allows for an immediate decline. The second grouping is called obstruction, which refers to impeding the flow of a certain task, effectively making the interaction more difficult than it needs to be with the intent to dissuade a particular action. So as you can see, this one includes Brignall's price comparison prevention and Roach Motel. Now, it may be tedious to go through every single dark pattern, but I'd still like to provide some concrete examples as to what some are. The Roach Motel that I just mentioned describes a situation that's easy to get into, but difficult to get out of. This usually occurs when a user signs up for a service easily, but closing their account or canceling the subscription is difficult or impossible. A common example is trying to delete your Amazon account. One case study attempted to walk through the process and highlighted how the user was met with dead end after dead end. And when they finally found the option for closing their account, they were redirected to having a conversation with an actual Amazon associate to proceed. This is poor user experience that intentionally makes it difficult, if not near impossible, to do something that hurts Amazon. Third, we have sneaking, which is an attempt to hide, disguise, or delay the divulging of information that has relevance to the user. So this could include things like undisclosed costs. So for instance, in this example, you'll notice that the dark pattern on the left includes a setup charge at checkout by default and places the onus on the user to opt out, whereas the ethical pattern on the right allows the user to choose to add it on to begin with. Fourthly, we have forced action, which is any situation where users are required to perform a specific action to access or continue to access specific functionalities. Named after Facebook's CEO, privacy zuckering here refers to tricking users into sharing more information about themselves than they would intend to or would agree to. And rounding it out at number 5, we have my personal favorite, which is interface interference. This is any manipulation of the user interface that privileges specific actions over others. The reason I say favorite is because confirm shaming was the reason I actually chose this topic to begin with. Prior to this research, I didn't know the term dark pattern, but I had increasingly come across instances of confirm shaming online, which is where content is written in a way to shame the user or make them feel bad for not doing a certain action. So for example, don't you want free stuff? If not, your option is specifically phrased as you preferring to miss out here. And there's nothing like seeing real life examples. In the top middle, we have the classic, no thanks, I prefer to pay full price when offered a discount. They've also gotten creative too. Another favorite of mine is on the bottom left, where refusing a consultation for a brand identity overhaul is slyly phrased as no thanks, I have Microsoft Paint. So understandably, a question you may have lingering right now is, aren't dark patterns just really smart marketing? To which my answer is, it's tempting to see it that way, but often that can be a cause for concern. The challenge is thinking of this issue in terms of user agency. Cognitive biases and the psychology of design have been used for a long time to implement persuasion tactics on the internet. However, the accusation here is that dark patterns actually exploit consumer psychology and sometimes cross an ethical line. Dark patterns are where stakeholder value is maximized and user value is minimized, prioritizing things like business profits and data collection at the expense of consumers. As a result of this unequal balancing of value, dark patterns cause various harms to consumers. So for one, a person will be disadvantaged by not having the agency or choice to make informed decisions online. They may also experience discrimination based on demographic identifiers. Users can feel shamed or tricked into pursuing unintended directions. They may be forced into a subscription that they didn't make the choice to actually sign up for, and have their purchasing decisions manipulated, causing lost finances. They may experience a lack of privacy based on manipulative designs that involve data collection. And finally, they may just have their time wasted as a result of companies deliberately making certain paths more cumbersome for profit motives. So as we turn to the literature, it's important to note that dark patterns can disproportionately harm certain populations. Groups that are already marginalized, such as those with less technical literacy, those who speak English as a second language, low-income earners, and those with lower education levels may be especially vulnerable. Now, although there were a lot of interesting studies, for the purpose of this presentation, I've chosen to focus on the findings of dark pattern prevalence to demonstrate how pervasive they really are. So in 2019, Mathur et al. Conducted a study analyzing dark patterns across 11,000 most popular shopping websites globally, and they found over 1,800 instances of dark patterns in this e-commerce environment, with a majority of examples proving to be deceptive, covert, and information hiding. Shifting the environment to apps, in 2020, Geronimo et al. Analyzed the top 240 free-to-use mobile applications on the Google Play Store, which included apps like Facebook, Amazon, and Twitter. Here, 95% of apps included one or more dark pattern in their interface. So relating it back to the taxonomies I introduced earlier, the authors showcased the percentage of apps with at least one occurrence in each subcategory. And as you can see here, false hierarchies, pre-selection, nagging, and roach motel were the most popular across apps in the study. And now we come to the very relevant question, who is being sued for dark patterns and on what grounds? Now, there are multiple lawsuits, but I chose these two as relevant and recent examples. Noom, for one, is a health and lifestyle application that saw an exponential growth in revenue during the pandemic with over 50 million downloads worldwide. However, a core element of Noom's success can be reduced to the deceptive enrollment scheme where customers were enrolled into costly multi-month plans without their consent once the trial period was up. As a result, a $100 million nationwide class action lawsuit was filed against Noom in the US, claiming fraud, and in February of this year, the case was settled for $56 million. Now moving on, currently 4 attorney generals across the US are suing Google for their deceptive use of location tracking. However, perhaps even more interesting is how earlier this year, France fined Google $170 million and Facebook $68 million over their use of dark patterns and cookie consent on their platforms. So it was found that both companies did not give users a clear way to reject non-essential cookies. So in addition to the fines, Facebook and Google are being given 3 months to change their presentation of cookie options in order to make refusing cookies just as straightforward as accepting them. So now for policy options. The Canadian government has not taken action on dark patterns so far, so how should policymakers proceed? Considering the breadth of issues that dark patterns touch on, such as competition, privacy, and consumer protection, it seemed ineffective to specifically target potential policy options at either the federal or the provincial territorial governments. So what follows is a brief analysis of these 3 general areas. For one, we have competition, to which you may think, how does this relate here? Well, dark patterns impact something called decisional privacy, otherwise known as one's ability to make choices free of coercion. Manipulating the free will of the consumer can unjustly concentrate power and attention in the hands of few corporations and therefore impacts competition. Part 7 of the current Competition Act addresses deceptive marketing practices, which involve false or misleading representations, bait and switch selling, and more. However, there's no mention of manipulation. So here, a policy option could be a revision of the Competition Act to include manipulative tactics in order to more specifically target the harms of dark patterns online and ensure this digital manipulation doesn't have far-reaching anti-competitive effects. Moving on to privacy, I touch on these 3 examples in my paper, but for today, I'll focus on the California Privacy Rights Act because it was the first legislation of its kind to explicitly regulate dark patterns in the US and include a definition of dark patterns in legislation. Now, the CPRA is set to take effect at the start of 2023 and does not ban all dark patterns, but rather it specifically focuses on those that have the substantial effect of subverting or impairing a consumer's choice to opt out in cases where personal data is monetized. In California, businesses who do not comply with the legislation face fines of up to $7,500 per violation, which can add up quick with dark patterns. And these businesses are first offered a notice to cure, which allows them a 30-day window to adjust their website or app design to meet the regulation standards. So how can something similar be applied in Canada? My suggestion is to amend the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA for short, in order to add a provision similar to the CPRA, which targets dark patterns that impact a consumer's ability to consent on their personal data. This would help protect user privacy and offer a similar 30-day window to companies to alter their problematic design. And finally, we have consumer protection, which is provincial and territorial jurisdiction. The DETOR Act, which stands for Deceptive Experiences to Online Users Reduction Act, was introduced as a bipartisan bill in 2019 in the US, and it made it illegal for large online services who possessed over 100 million monthly active users to engage in dark patterns, or more specifically to design, modify, or manipulate a user interface with the purpose of substantially affecting, obscuring, subverting, or impairing user autonomy, decision-making, or the choice to opt out and consent. In Canada, provincial and territorial consumer protection legislation, like the Ontario Consumer Protection Act, can be modified to incorporate DETOR-esque elements that go beyond merely looking at unfair practices. And finally, the last one to throw it in is education. The Federal Trade Commission in the US hosted a virtual workshop in April 2021 to examine dark patterns by gathering researchers, legal experts, consumer advocates, and industry professionals together. Now, there's a deficiency of research done within a Canadian context on the proliferation of dark patterns and what this means for different stakeholders in the country. Therefore, the final option that the Canadian government can pursue is something similar to a workshop session through an independent enforcement agency like the Competition Bureau, in order to advance this topic further and also brainstorm the best way to educate consumers on this matter. Now, although I think each of these options I've identified can and should be pursued in Canada, my final recommendation is to start with option 3, consumer protection, and option 4, education or research. The rationale is as follows. For consumer protection, a provision modeled after the DETOR Act would target massive companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, who have been continually called out for their mobilizations of dark patterns across their platforms. And this would work to more broadly cover all manipulative instances of dark patterns, rather than singling in only on interactions involving personal information like the privacy option I presented. Although it's worth mentioning that this option does come with limitations. For one, delegating actions to province or territories could mean we see a response to dark patterns that's fragmented or stagnated across different jurisdictions. And above all, the underlying limitation is that it's difficult to legislate around the psychological tricks of UX design. As I hope you've gotten a glimpse of, dark patterns can exist in this odd gray area, which walks a thin line between deception or manipulation on one hand and smart marketing on the other. So these are just things to keep in mind regardless of the desired course of action. And the other option, for option 4, education is important not only for advancing research in Canada, but because various studies have identified something called dark pattern blindness, which refers to how a majority of people struggle with dark pattern identification. Therefore, public awareness will be key. And this concludes my presentation on dark patterns. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions at this time.